I was still holding the phone when my hands started shaking so badly that I had to set it down on the kitchen counter, because if I kept holding it, I was going to throw it through the window. The photo was right there on my sister's page, 31 people liking it in the first 10 minutes. My mother's arm wrapped around my father's waist on some lakeside dock in Michigan, my brother Kyle grinning with a beer in his hand, and my sister Dana's caption sitting underneath it like a knife someone had left out in the open on purpose. Best trip ever, and she's not around LL, 3 laughing emojis. I read it 4 times before the words actually landed, before I understood that she was me, that the joke, the actual punchline of my own family's holiday weekend, was my absence. Not my late grandmother, whose empty chair everyone's toasted every Thanksgiving. Not the family dog who passed the year before. Me, 34 years old, sitting alone in the house I'd bought with money I'd saved working double shifts at a hospital lab for 6 years, and I was the punchline. 20 minutes earlier, I had been fine. Not happy, exactly, because Labor Day weekend alone was never anyone's idea of a good time. But fine, functional. Making myself a grilled cheese sandwich, and telling myself that my family had simply gone up to the lake house without me because I'd told them, back in July, that I had a huge project deadline at work and probably couldn't make the drive. That was true. I had said that. What I hadn't expected was that probably couldn't make it would somehow become, in the retelling, an entire inside joke that apparently the whole family had been enjoying without me knowing I was the subject of it. I scrolled further down the comments, and that's when the floor really dropped out from under me, because my Aunt Carol had written, "Lol, you all deserve a peaceful weekend for once." And my mother had replied with a single crying lawing emoji, and Kyle had commented, "No drama, no problem," with a thumbs up. And I sat there in my kitchen with a half-made sandwich going cold, trying to figure out what drama I had ever caused that would make an entire extended family celebrate a weekend without me like it was a vacation from a hurricane. I want to explain who I am before I explain what I did. Because what happened over the following 4 months only makes sense if you understand that I am not a dramatic person. I am the person who reads contracts twice. I am the person who keeps receipts in a folder by year. When I was 26 and my father's small hardware store nearly went under because a supplier scammed him on a shipment of lumber, I was the one who found the fraud in the invoices, the one who sat with him at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, building a case that got him his money back. When my mother's health insurance denied a claim that would have bankrupted her, I was the one who spent 3 weeks on the phone with appeals departments until it got approved. I tell you this not to make myself sound like a saint, because I'm not, but because it matters for what comes later that I am, and have always been, the family's fixer, the reliable one, the one who shows up. And somewhere along the way, being reliable had apparently curdled, in my family's eyes, into being a burden, because reliable people don't get thanked, they get expected, and expected people eventually get resented for the exact thing that used to be valued. I didn't respond to the post. I didn't call anyone screaming, and I didn't fire off some devastating text that I'd regret. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I closed the laptop, finished making my sandwich, and ate it standing at the counter while I thought, really thought, about the last 2 years of my life. Because that photo had cracked something open, and now I couldn't stop the flood of memory that came pouring through the gap. I thought about Christmas, when I'd paid for the ham, the wine, and half the gifts under the tree because Kyle was between jobs again, and nobody had so much as texted me a thank you the next morning. I thought about my parents' 35th anniversary party, which I had planned, budgeted, and mostly paid for, and how my mother had introduced me to her friends that night as their accountant, not her daughter, like I was hired help who happened to share her last name. I thought about the fact that 3 months earlier, when I'd finally, after years of saving, put a down payment on my own house, the first thing my mother said was, "Well, I guess now you won't have time for us," as if buying property was an act of abandonment rather than an accomplishment. Every one of those moments, on its own, I had let go. Small cuts heal. But a photo with a caption that turned my absence into a punchline wasn't a small cut. It was the moment I finally saw the pattern instead of the individual wounds. And once you see a pattern, you cannot unsee it. The next morning, I called Dana, calmly, and asked her, in a tone I kept deliberately light, what the caption meant. She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Oh my God, don't be so sensitive. It was just a joke. You always turn everything into something serious." I asked her whose idea the caption was. She hesitated for half a second, too long before saying, "It was just something that came up in the group chat." And that's when I learned there was a group chat I wasn't in. Not the family group chat I'd been part of for years, the one where we coordinated holidays and shared photos of my niece's soccer game. A different one. A second one. Dana let it slip without meaning to. Said something like, "It's just the chat we use to plan stuff without it turning into a whole production." And I asked her, still calm, still light, turning into a whole production how? And she said the thing that I would replay in my head for weeks afterward. The thing that told me everything I needed to know about how my family actually saw me. You just always have opinions about everything. About money, about who's doing what. And it's exhausting. So we just started planning things separately so it's easier. I had spent years being the one who made things easier for every single one of them. And the reward for that labor was being quietly excised from the family's actual conversations while still being expected to show up, pay up, and smile in the photos when it was convenient for them. I didn't cry until that night, and when I did, it wasn't really about the lake house or the caption. It was about realizing that somewhere along the way, I had become a resource to my family rather than a person, a wallet with a face attached, useful specifically in proportion to what I could provide and resented in exact proportion to any inconvenience I represented. And here is the thing about people like me, the fixers, the reliable ones. We are excellent at solving other people's problems and remarkably slow to recognize when we are the problem being solved. That night I made a decision, not out of rage, though the rage was real, but out of something colder and more useful. I decided I was going to stop being useful to people who had made it clear I wasn't wanted, and I was going to do it in a way that they would understand. Eventually, even if it took them months to understand it. The first thing I did was nothing, which was harder than it sounds. I didn't confront anyone else. I didn't post an angry response. I simply started paying attention, really paying attention, to the shape of my involvement in my family's finances and logistics, because once I started looking, I realized how much of the machinery of family togetherness I had been quietly running without anyone acknowledging it, let alone thanking me for it. I was the one whose credit card was on file for the family's shared streaming accounts, 4 of them, because you're better with that stuff. I was the one who had, 2 years earlier, cosigned a car loan for Kyle when his credit wasn't good enough on his own. A loan that still had 11 months left on it, and that he was, I discovered when I quietly checked, already 41 days late on. I was the one who had set up the recurring transfer that covered my parents' internet and cable bundle after my father's hours got cut at the store, a temporary arrangement that had quietly become permanent over 3 years without anyone ever proposing an end date. I was, in effect, an invisible financial backbone that my family relied on completely while simultaneously running a second, secret social life specifically designed to exclude me from it. I want to be honest about something, because this story isn't worth telling if I pretend I was some flawless, saintly figure who did all of this for purely selfless reasons. Part of why I've kept doing it, the co-signing, the bill paying, the party planning, was that it gave me a role. It made me matter. If I was the one who fixed things, then I had a place at the table, even when I felt, in every other way, like an afterthought in that family. Realizing that was almost more painful than the lake house photo, because it meant I had been complicit in my own diminishment, trading real belonging for a functional, transactional kind of usefulness, and telling myself it was the same thing. So I stopped, but I stopped like an engineer, not like someone having a breakdown. Over the following 6 weeks, I quietly, methodically, and completely legally extracted myself from every piece of financial infrastructure that connected me to my family. I called the loan servicer for Kyle's car and learned that as a cosigner, I had no power to remove myself from the loan without his cooperation or a refinance. But I did have every right to stop covering for his missed payments, which I had been doing without him even knowing, transferring money quietly into his account before the due date so his credit, and by extension my credit, wouldn't take a hit. I stopped. I didn't tell him. I simply let the natural consequence of his own missed payment happen for the first time in almost a year. I canceled my card from the 4 streaming accounts, not with anger, just with a calm text to the family chat, the real one, the one I was still in, saying I needed to consolidate my expenses for some house repairs and would be removing my card from the shared subscriptions. Everyone was welcome to set up their own. I let the internet and cable transfer to my parents' laps, again with a simple, business-like text explaining that with my new mortgage, I needed to tighten my own budget, and I trusted they'd understand. Nobody understood, not right away. What surprised me was how fast the mask came off once the money stopped moving quietly in the background. Within 2 weeks, my mother called not to ask how I was doing, but to ask, with real alarm in her voice, why the cable had been shut off. I explained gently that I'd stopped covering it because I needed to focus on my own finances after buying the house. The house she'd told me would mean I wouldn't have time for them, and there was a long silence on the line before she said, "I just assumed that was something you wanted to keep doing." Wanted, as though 3 years of unacknowledged bill payments had been a hobby of mine rather than a quiet, unthanked obligation I'd absorbed because nobody else offered. Kyle's reaction was louder. He called me 9 days after his missed car payment showed up as a red mark, screaming, genuinely screaming, asking why I hadn't covered it like I always did, and I let him finish. And then I said something I'd practiced in my head for exactly this moment. "I'm not your financial safety net anymore, Kyle. I never agreed to be a permanent one. I did it because I love you, but loving you doesn't mean absorbing consequences that are yours to face." He hung up on me. 2 days later, Dana texted me, not Kyle, saying I was being cruel, that I knew Kyle was struggling, that family helps family. And I wrote back, and this was the only pointed thing I let myself say in the entire 6 weeks. Families also doesn't plan trips specifically to exclude one of its own and then joke about it online. I'm allowed to redraw my own boundaries, too. She didn't respond to that message for 4 days. Here is where the story could have simply ended, with me quietly stepping back, my family scrambling to cover their own bills, everyone a little colder to each other for a season, and eventually some uneasy détente where nothing was really resolved but the surface tension smoothed over, because that's what families do. They let things go unspoken until the next explosion. But something else happened in October that changed the entire shape of what I was dealing with. Something that made me realize the lake house joke wasn't even the real story. It was just the thread that, once pulled, unraveled something much bigger. My father called me, sounding smaller than I'd ever heard him, and asked if I could come by the store to look something over. When I got there, he was sitting in the back office, surrounded by folders, and he told me that a man named Russ Pemberton, an old friend of Kyle's from high school, who'd been working part-time at the store for about a year doing deliveries, and some of the ordering, had disappeared 3 days earlier without notice, and that when my father had gone into the store's accounting software to figure out payroll for the week, he'd found things that didn't add up, inventory logged as delivered that had never actually arrived at the store, payments to a supplier called Northfield Distribution that didn't match anything in the actual order history. My father, bless him, had never fully trusted computers and had let Russ, at Kyle's vague, offhand recommendation 18 months earlier, take over the store's ordering and basic bookkeeping because the kid's good with that stuff and I'm not. Nobody had ever checked Russ's work. Nobody had thought to. I spent the next 4 hours going through the books with my father, and by the end of it, my hands were cold because what I was looking at wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was theft, patient and deliberate, spread out over more than a year in amounts small enough not to trigger obvious alarm on any single transaction, but large enough, cumulatively, to have quietly drained the store of just over $61,000. Northfield Distribution, when I looked it up, wasn't a real supplier at all. It was a shell, registered to a PO, boxed 2 towns over, and the payments to it had been dressed up as legitimate inventory purchases, invoices forged well enough that my father, doing a cursory glance every month, had never questioned them. And here is the detail that made my stomach turn over completely. The bank account behind Northfield Distribution, when I eventually got a forensic accountant friend to help trace the wire details months later through the fraud investigation, was in Russ Pemberton's name, but the initial vendor account, the one that had been set up in the store's system to allow the payments to go out automatically, had been created and approved using login credentials that belonged, according to the system's own access logs, to Kyle. I sat with that fact for 2 full days before I said anything to anyone, because I needed to be sure, and because I understood, with a clarity that honestly frightened me a little, that whatever I did next was going to determine not just what happened to the money, but what happened to my entire family for years to come. I am not, and was not then, interested in revenge, in the sense of humiliating my brother for the sake of humiliating him. I had spent my whole life being the person who fixed things quietly, and old habits don't disappear just because you've decided to stop absorbing consequences for other people. But I also understood, looking at those access logs, that fixing this the old way, quietly covering for Kyle, protecting him from the fallout, letting my father believe it was entirely Russ's doing, would simply be another version of the exact pattern that had led me to that lonely kitchen counter with a cold sandwich and a photo that called my absence a blessing. I was done being the silent structural support that let everyone else avoid consequences. So I did the only thing that felt honest, which was also, I would come to learn, the most effective thing I could have done. I didn't confront Kyle directly. I didn't scream at him or accuse him at Thanksgiving in front of everyone, which is the kind of dramatic, satisfying scene you'd expect if this were fiction, instead of something that actually happened to a real family trying to survive its own dysfunction. Instead, I sat my father down, alone, and walked him through exactly what the record showed, calmly, factually, with printouts and highlighted lines, the same way I'd once helped him with the lumber supplier fraud years earlier. I told him what I'd found about the vendor account credentials. I told him I thought he needed to loop in an actual attorney and probably the police. Not because I wanted Kyle destroyed, but because $61,000 was real money that had come out of a small business house my father had built over 26 years. And pretending otherwise to protect one person's feelings wasn't fair to him or to the store's future. My father cried at that kitchen table, the first time I'd seen him cry since my grandmother's funeral, and asked me the question I think he'd been almost too afraid to ask out loud. Did I think Kyle had done this on purpose, had stolen from him, or had he just been careless, let Russ use his login, been too trusting the way my father himself had been too trusting? I told him honestly that I didn't know for certain, that the access logs showed Kyle's credentials but not necessarily Kyle's hands on the keyboard, and that this was exactly why it needed to go to someone with actual investigative authority rather than staying a family argument that would just calcify into another grudge nobody ever resolved. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't interested in assuming the worst about my brother for the satisfaction of being right. I was interested in the truth coming out through a process that couldn't be argued away at a holiday dinner table. The investigation, once it started, moved slower than anyone wanted, but it moved. What it eventually revealed, over the following 2 months, was more complicated and more painful than a simple story of a brother stealing from his own father. Kyle hadn't invented the scheme. Russ had, using Kyle's login because Kyle, characteristically careless with things that weren't immediately in front of him, had given Russ his password months earlier so Russ could help out with ordering on days Kyle wasn't around, never imagining Russ would use it for anything beyond the job he'd actually been hired to do. Kyle hadn't known about Northfield Distribution. He hadn't seen a cent of the $61,000. But he had been reckless and irresponsible in a way that had directly enabled the theft, and when confronted by the investigating detective, his first instinct, tellingly, had been to lie about having shared his credentials at all, a lie that fell apart within a day, once the store's IT logs were properly examined, and that made him look, for a period of about a week, far more guilty than he actually was. I want to tell you that the resolution was purely satisfying, that Russ went to prison, and everyone hugged and understood the lesson, but real life rarely wraps up that cleanly. Russ Pemberton was located 4 weeks later in another state, arrested, and eventually pleaded guilty to a fraud charge that resulted in a restitution order and a suspended sentence with probation, which frustrated all of us, but which our attorney explained was fairly typical for a first offense of this size and dollar amount, and which at least meant my father would, slowly, over a court-ordered payment schedule, recover some portion of what had been stolen. Kyle wasn't charged with anything, because he genuinely hadn't taken the money, but he was understandably made to feel the full weight of what his carelessness had cost. And more importantly, he was finally made to sit in a room with my father and hear directly, without me smoothing it over for him the way I always had, how much that betrayal of trust, intentional or not, had actually hurt. Here is what I think of as the real turning point of this whole story, the part that had nothing to do with money at all. During one of the family meetings we had while the investigation was still ongoing, meetings that I organized and, notably, was finally included in without question, because suddenly my opinions about money were exactly what everyone needed. My mother said something to me quietly after everyone else had left the room. She said, "I don't know what we would have done without you figuring this out." And I looked at her, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I said exactly what I was thinking instead of what would keep the peace. I told her that I appreciated her saying that, but that I needed her to understand something. I couldn't keep being the person this family only valued in a crisis while being the punchline the rest of the time. I told her about the lake house toast, which I don't think she'd actually understood the weight of until that moment, because to her it had seemed like harmless fun, a joke among people who loved each other, and she hadn't stopped to consider what it looked like from the other side of the screen. I watched her face change as I explained it, watched something genuinely uncomfortable settle into her expression, and she didn't argue with me. She just said, "I didn't think about how that would look to you," which wasn't a full apology, but it was, for my mother, close enough to real honesty that I let myself believe it mattered. The months that followed weren't a fairy tale transformation. Kyle and I are still working out what our relationship looks like, and there are days it's stiff and awkward between us in a way it never used to be. Though I'd argue what used to pass for closeness between us wasn't particularly real either, just convenience dressed up as affection. Dana apologized to me properly, eventually, in December, not with a text, but with an actual conversation where she admitted that the second group chat had started originally as a small, thoughtless joke about how intense I could get about logistics and money, and had slowly, over months, calcified into something crueler than any of them had really intended, the way group dynamics do when nobody stops to question where the joke is heading. I believed her, mostly, because I recognized the shape of it, the way small unkindness compounds when nobody's paying attention, the same way small, unacknowledged sacrifices had compounded on my side, until they became resentment I hadn't even let myself name. What I did not do, in the end, was ruin anyone's life, expose anyone publicly, or seek some dramatic, cinematic comeuppance, because that was never actually what I wanted. Even in my angriest moments, standing in that kitchen with a cold sandwich, what I wanted, it turned out, once I sat with the anger long enough to see past it, was simply to stop being invisible in my own family, to stop being useful and unseen at the same time. The lake house joke was cruel, but it was also, strangely, the thing that finally forced everyone to actually look at what my quiet reliability had been holding up, and what it cost me to keep holding it up alone. I didn't destroy my family to prove a point. I just stopped absorbing the weight of things that were never mine to carry by myself. And in the space they created, for the first time in years, my family had to actually reckon with who I was instead of what I did for them. This past Labor Day, 1 year after that photo appeared on Dana's page, we all went up to the lake house together, all of us. And somewhere around sunset, my father raised a glass on the dock and said, without any prompting from me, that this year's trip was the best one, because everyone who mattered was actually there. Nobody laughed. Nobody added a joke on top of it. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand, and Kyle, a little awkwardly, a little too formally, thanked me for something he still struggled to fully name. And I let the moment be exactly as imperfect and unresolved as it actually was, because that felt more honest than pretending everything had healed into something tidy. Some things don't get fixed all at once. But I wasn't the invisible fixer standing outside the frame anymore, waiting to be needed and mocked in the same breath. I was just there, present, seen, a person instead of a punchline. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that felt like enough.